Today we want to talk about Empress Wu Zetian and the Tang Dynasty. With a heart like a serpent and a nature like that of a wolf, she favored evil sycophants and destroyed good and loyal officials. She killed her sister, butchered her elder brothers, murdered the ruler, poisoned her mother. She is hated by gods and men alike. These are just two of the comments made about Empress Wu Zetian, the only female empress in all of Chinese history. What can the life of Wu Zetian tell us about the Tang Dynasty, the dynasty that ruled China from 618 to 907? What can her life tell us about the role of women in China at this time? Finally, what can her legacy tell us about how we remember the past? The Tang Dynasty, with its capital in Chang'an, was one of the most international and cosmopolitan periods in Chinese history. The Tang Dynasty also increased the amount of territory under Chinese control, with the empire expanding borders and incorporating many lands in the northwest that were an important part of the Silk Road. Goods, ideas, and peoples flowed back and forth through the Silk Road that linked China, Central Asia, India, and Europe. The Tang also developed maritime trade with Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. With so many trading relations, there were actually a number of foreign merchants living in the Chinese capital at Chang'an, and the streets of the city were filled with music, food, and people from all over the world. In arts, culture, and literature, it was a golden age. Even today, school children in China memorize poems from this era. It was also during this period that Buddhism reached its heights in China. Some things about the Tang Dynasty are surprising from our point of view today. A popular activity at the elite level was polo, a game that had come to China through Central Asian influences. Wu Zetian grew up, lived in, and contributed to this cultural period. Wu Zetian was born to a prosperous family with a father serving in government. During her early life, she received an education, learning poetry and calligraphy, somewhat rare for a young woman at the time. She became a concubine at the court of Emperor Taizong of the Tang Dynasty when she was just 14. As one historian reminds us, admissions to the ranks of the palace concubines was equivalent to winning a beauty contest of the most gorgeous women in the medieval world. However, Wu Zetian never won the emperor's favor. Concubines at the imperial court were ranked, and Wu always remained at the lower level of the hierarchy. When that emperor died, since Wu had bore him no children, she entered a Buddhist monastery, as was custom for concubines at the time. Throughout the first part of the Tang Dynasty, Buddhism grew in size and power. In fact, becoming a Buddhist nun sometimes represented a way for Chinese women to avoid an unwanted arranged marriage. Entering the monastery meant removing yourself from the world. At this time, Wu Zetian was still quite young, and she seemed deemed for a life outside of the imperial palace and shut inside the Buddhist monastery. However, Wu Zetian did not remain at the Buddhist monastery for long. The next emperor, Emperor Gaozong, had taken a liking to her when Wu was still his father's concubine. Some people even suggested that the new emperor had previously had an affair with Wu Zetian when she was still the deceased emperor's concubine. This type of relationship would have been very much against the rules of the time. This gossip was just one of the many rumors that followed Wu Zetian throughout her later life and even after her death. The new emperor soon brought her back to the palace from the Buddhist monastery, and Wu eventually bore him a son, and the emperor raised her rank, although she still remained a concubine. That was when Wu supposedly committed her most heinous act. Remember, at this time Wu was the concubine of the emperor and had bore him a son. One day, the emperor's wife came to visit Wu in the rooms in her palace. After the emperor's wife left, Wu Zetian strangled her infant son to death and blamed it on the emperor's wife. The emperor believed this story. He soon raised Wu from simply a concubine to his main wife and gave her the title of Empress. Now, soon thereafter, the emperor suffered several medical problems, and it often fell to Wu Zetian to make decisions about state affairs. Because she was a woman, she had to make these decisions behind the veil, because her ministers were not allowed to see her. She carried out these duties well. Though personally drawn to Buddhism, she followed Confucian rituals and patterns of governing, relying on trained and loyal officials, as well as continuing to hold exams to fill positions in the bureaucracy. After her husband, the emperor, finally died in 683, she dispatched or marginalized several of her sons who should have inherited the throne. This series of removals eventually led to a revolt of Tang Dynasty nobles that Wu Zetian eventually put down. When she was 65 years old and had been involved in court politics for nearly her entire life, she declared the start of her own dynasty, the Zhou Dynasty. She continued to rule through her 70s, but like many rulers before her, she confronted the problem of how to best choose a successor, a constant problem in Chinese history. She died soon thereafter in 705 AD, and the Tang Dynasty continued on. Wu Zetian is an important figure in Chinese history, but her legacy is controversial. After her death, Wu Zetian's memorial marker was left blank, implying that the jury was still out on what her rule meant. This was unusual. Usually the children of a former ruler carve into stone the accomplishments of the deceased monarch's reign. Wu Zetian's offspring did not perform this duty. In a way, it was as though her legacy was left blank. Other people wrote plenty about her, though, often stressing the bad aspects of her personality and her rule. We can see in Wu Zetian's story some of the double standards when people at the time and later writers evaluate male and female rulers. When male rulers participate in palace intrigue, outmaneuver their enemies, and sometimes eliminate them by murder, they are labeled as crafty, and their behavior and political acumen are admired. When a female ruler does similar things, the first reaction is not to judge her as crafty, but as cruel and wicked. Such were the judgments made about Wu Zetian when she was alive and soon after her death. This double standard in evaluating male and female rulers is not just a part of Chinese history, but a much wider phenomenon that spans geographic region and time period. It is possible to see similar judgments concerning the British Queen Elizabeth I in the 1500s and the Russian ruler Catherine the Great in the 1700s. In the Chinese context, the reign of Wu Zetian marked the only time that a woman held power as the Empress of China. Women were not allowed to take part in the civil service exam system that served as a mechanism for selecting government officials. Though many elite women learned to read, write, and compose poetry, often with just as much or more than ability than men, they were not able to serve in government in any formal capacity. The legacy of Empress Wu is still up for debate, even today, more than 1,000 years after she was alive. In early 2015, a TV series in China called Empress of China revisited the story of Empress Wu Zetian. In 96 episodes, it covered her life from concubine to ruling behind the scenes to declaring her own short-lived empire. Unlike earlier depictions that painted her as evil and manipulative, this series showed her as forced by circumstances. She was not evil, only doing the best she could in a dangerous time. It was a much different take on Wu Zetian than was common before. These types of portrayals generally showed Wu as willing to do anything in order to cling to power. What do you think of Empress Wu Zetian's story? Where else can we see examples in the double standard often employed when talking about male and female rulers?